Good evening, everyone. I am hit record and I would like to open us in prayer. Let us pray. Prayer for the human family, which is found on page 815 in the Book of Common Prayer. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We might come back to that prayer this evening, later this evening, but it's a great prayer. If you don't know, the prayer for the human family on page 815, definitely make that a part of your, prayer that you pray with some frequency. Let me share the screen. I don't have as much as I have in previous weeks as far as historical background, because this is kind of in our historical memory. Well, maybe not. It seems like before COVID or after COVID or during COVID, all of our memory has gotten a little crazy. So I want to talk about the Obama speech in Charleston, and I've got a little background information today. Here's what I want to do, because we're talking about the year 2015. We're talking about the year 2015. I don't really need to get into a bunch of stuff, a bunch of background, but I do want to talk about some Lenten themes as we have talked about these past few weeks. I do want to talk about the context of this speech, and I want to really watch probably a little more than probably about 17 minutes. I said 10 to 15 earlier, but then I just couldn't stop of the actual speech. I'll fast forward it through some themes, but there's a couple of sections I want you to see. I do think, since this is a Lenten course, we can talk about some of the theological themes here. Faith, you'll notice how he begins with faith. Grace will be another important theme. Oh my Lord, my dog has got the thing here. He's just not sitting. And hope, which is, I think, how he ends. So faith, grace, and hope. The Lenten theme, just before we begin, the Lenten themes I'd like to kind of remind you of is we are in the season of Lent, a season of reconciliation, a season of grace. It's a reconciliation between ourselves and God, and reconciliation between one another. So I hope you see some of those themes in this speech tonight. The discussions, because I want you to have these. I always like you to have these before we go into discussion later. I'd like to leave 20 minutes for discussion. So what strikes you about the speech? What did it teach you about faith, grace, or hope? So all these things as you're listening, what do you think is considered, why do you think it's considered one of the great American speeches? So be thinking about that. And what does it call you to do? So be thinking about what President Obama says in the end of this. Where is it moving you? Where is it calling you to do as a result of it? Ray Bird, I think you're unmuted. So let's look at the Mother Emanuel shooting 2015. I'm intentionally not wanting to spend a lot of time on the shooter, Dylan Roof. I don't like doing that. I hate when news broadcasts do that as well. It was a hate crime. There's a lot of evidence out there of what he was saying, what was found, what he was doing. He comes to the Bible study. The group welcomes him in. We know part of the story. Reverend Clem Pickney is the pastor, and so pastor and 8 others are shot. Um, that's about all I kind of want to spend on the backstory, and kind of his motives were obviously of hatred, and you'll see that in the speech. Mother Emanuel Church, if you've listened to John Meacham's podcast on this, is an important church. It's definitely got its roots. It definitely sits in a prominent spot in Charleston. It's got its own kind of history about Calhoun, which was next to it, John Calhoun's statue, not far down the street. It got another slide on it. It says one of the older, one of the older AME churches, founded in 1817. Did a lot of stuff during slavery, helped slaves. It's got a historical significance. Just a little backdrop on that, and why President Obama is there. So this horrible crime has happened in one of the mother churches, particularly predominantly black churches, AME churches in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, I'll call him Clem because that's what the president called him. And I figured if the president call you Clem, I can call you Clem. South Carolina native. He's so in a very AME, and President Obama talks about this African Methodist Episcopalian kind of way. Clem was a South Carolina native, but he was a state rep from 97 to 2000. He was a state senator from 2000 to 2015. And the head pastor of the congregation in 2010, appointed to Mother Emanuel. So he's got a foot in a lot of in being a Democrat representative and senator for the state, foot in politics, foot in the pulpit, and that's how Black Church does it. And Obama says that a couple of times in the speech. Historic day on kind of, let's go into the backdrop of the day, and John Meacham definitely does. A big milestone for the Supreme Court, and that day, that same day, June 26th. So you can imagine President Obama began the day in the Oval Office that morning, kind of coming to an end of his presidency. In the last chapter, I guess you could say, of his presidency. That's where he is in the morning, talking about marriage equality. And that evening / afternoon, he's down in Charleston, South Carolina. So you could see the day in some ways as a theme about grace and love. It's the title of the speech will be "Amazing Grace." You can see how that, looking back for him, might be something big. If you listen to the podcast, I think this. The John Meacham podcast, this might be an important moment, I think, of setting up the speech. You have a presidency toward the end of his time, which I think does shape the way you view things and the way you do things as a leader. I think he's willing to bear a little of him, show a little of himself in the pulpit that you might not have seen a very composed lawyer do. He still kind of fights that inner lawyer with him. You'll see when he kind of breaks out into song. Mrs. Pinckney said a kind of a moment for her in that interview in the podcast was when Obama met with him before the service, and she saw a connection between the girls and his girls. And you have to know there was probably a real connection there in the sense of, this could have been me. I can't help but think that doesn't, well, I know because I've gotten and done funeral eulogies before. There are moments that you just feel a connection, and so I think that probably impacted him in ways. Maybe he says, maybe he doesn't say, but she felt that happened then. So I want us to look at, as we get into the speech, and again, I'm not going to talk a lot tonight. I really want us to watch and talk later. The beginning of this, and so. As you see, and as Meacham points out, one of the real reasons this is maybe one of the great speeches in American history is, should be up there. And there's a lot of great speeches, but this should be something to consider. The unique thing about this is he kind of takes the bully pulpit and really runs it into the pulpit. He is speaking at a service. He is doing a eulogy. You'll see the casket in front of him, and he gets into politics in the middle of it, and we'll see some of it, but I do want to kind of keep the message theological. I'll tell you what that is when we get to them. We can talk about that at the end. He begins. There's no this is not a political message. I mean, you're not, he comes right in at the beginning. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. I mean, he's right there in a big passage. Those are his opening lines, and you'll see that. He's going to leave no doubt what he's doing in this message. So from the beginning, he's going to go with faith. It's going to be more of a eulogy / a homily. In the middle, he's going to pick up the theme of grace, and we can talk about this in the end, and the podcast certainly does. This was kind of a section in there that the New York Times, if you look at this in the New York Times, will say that when they kind of did a post-mortem on the speech, that he took it, he saw it, and he saw this kind of little nugget on amazing grace, and he rewrote this thing. They said in a very rare sort of moment for him, he took the legal pad out and just tore this thing up, and really this had a lot of his hand on it. He wanted to go that way. He'd been moved by what he had seen. He saw that line, and suddenly this kind of starts weaving through. Philip, you got a hand raised?
Yeah, we do talk about presidents, doing speeches. Do we know that President Obama wrote this speech for himself?
So I think there was, from what I've seen from this podcast, and then in a New York Times article, I'll try to find it sometime and throw it in there, that he probably some of it was drafted, and then he put a lot of ink in it. That's what people will say, that he took a draft and reconfigured and wrote a lot, probably more of this speech than anything. And you'll see in that article, it pulls from different parts of some other speeches that he's read. I'll throw that in there, Philip. But I think it's safe.
It's good to know. But when you do, you are saying a lot that it was his speech. So I believe you. Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. I'll show you this article. It's hard to, but I think the podcast wants you to lead to believe that there's a lot of his hand in this one, and so grace is going to be the theme. In the end, he ends in song. Now, if I go over here in one of these minutes while this thing's going, I might, and we've got some African Americans on here. Now, I've studied a lot of African American preaching, and there is a definite, you want to end kind of strong, and he does. I mean, so he almost has to take the room into song and into music to end the way he ends, and you'll see all this. And I think there's a reason behind the song, multiple levels. We can talk more about this in the end. I want to set up Hebrews 11. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. By faith. This is a part of, this is something you would see, and since we're talking about this in American history, this is something you would see, and since I'm a descendant of the Pilgrims, that's heavily shaped William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. The Pilgrims came over by faith, and so I think in a moment in our national history, in a moment of catastrophe, of a massacre, I think he begins for that reason, talking about faith, talking about being people of faith, is he's trying to kind of speak to the moment, but maybe speak to a national narrative, and definitely to, I think, a Judeo-Christian kind of experience, because this is that passage will talk a lot about Abraham. So without any further ado, let's take the first 10 minutes. So mute yourself if you're not muted, and here you go. I'm going to take you from minute 1 to 10, or 17 seconds to 10 minutes. So sit back, remember the things to be looking for. Setting the theme. What are some of the themes you're going to hear about faith for the most part right here?
The Bible calls us to hope, to persevere, and have faith in things not seen. They were still living by faith when they died, Scripture tells us. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. We are here today to remember a man of God who lived by faith. A man who believed in things not seen. A man who believed there were better days ahead, off in the distance. A man of service who persevered, knowing full well he would not receive all those things he was promised, because he believed his efforts would deliver a better life for those who followed. To Jennifer, his beloved wife, to Ileana and Milana, his beautiful, wonderful daughters. To the Mother Emanuel family, the people of Charleston, the people of South Carolina. I cannot claim to have had the good fortune to know Reverend Pinckney well, but I did have the pleasure of knowing him and meeting him here in South Carolina, back when we were both a little bit younger. Back when I didn't have visible gray hair. The first thing I noticed was his graciousness, his smile, his reassuring baritone, his deceptive sense of humor. All qualities that helped him wear so effortlessly a heavy burden of expectation. Friends of his remarked this week that when Clementa Pinckney entered a room, it was like the future arrived. That even from a young age, folks knew he was special, anointed. He was the progeny of a long line of the faithful, a family of preachers who spread God's word, a family of protesters who sowed change to expand voting rights and desegregate the South. Clem heard their instruction, and he did not forsake their teaching. He was in the pulpit by 13, pastor by 18, public servant by 23. He did not exhibit any of the cockiness of youth, nor youth's insecurities. Instead, he set an example worthy of his position, wise beyond his years, in his speech, in his conduct, in his love, faith, and purity. As a senator, he represented a sprawling swath of the low country, a place that has long been one of the most neglected in America, a place still racked by poverty and inadequate schools, a place where children can still go hungry and the sick can go without treatment, a place that needed somebody like Clem. His position in the minority party meant the odds of winning more resources for his constituents were often long. His calls for greater equity were too often unheeded. The votes he casts were sometimes lonely. But he never gave up. He stayed true to his convictions. He would not grow discouraged. After a full day at the Capitol, he'd climb into his car and head to the church to draw sustenance from his family, from his ministry, from the community that loved and needed him. There he would fortify his faith and imagine what might be. Reverend Pinckney embodied a politics that was neither mean nor small. He conducted himself quietly and kindly and diligently. He encouraged progress not by pushing his ideas alone, but by seeking out your ideas, partnering with you to make things happen. He was full of empathy and fellow feeling, able to walk in somebody else's shoes and see through their eyes. No wonder one of his Senate colleagues remembered Senator Pinckney as the most gentle of the 46 of us, the best of the 46 of us. Clem was often asked why he chose to be a pastor and a public servant. But the person who asked probably didn't know the history of the AME Church. As our brothers and sisters in the AME Church know, we don't make those distinctions. Our calling, Clem once said, is not just within the walls of the congregation, but the life and community in which our congregation resides. He embodied the idea that our Christian faith demands deeds and not just words. That the sweet hour of prayer actually lasts the whole week long. That to put our faith in action is more than just individual salvation, it's about our collective salvation. To feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and house the homeless is not just a call for isolated charity, but the imperative of a just society. What a good man. Sometimes I think that's the best thing to hope for when you're eulogized. After all the words and recitations and resumes are read, to just say somebody was a good man. You don't have to be of high station to be a good man. Preacher by 13, pastor by 18, public servant by 23. What a life Clement Pinckney lived. What an example he set. What a model for his faith. And then to lose him at 41, slain in his sanctuary with 8 wonderful members of his flock, each at different stages in life, but bound together by a common commitment to God. Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tawanza Sanders, Daniel L. Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson. Good.
So yeah, I want to. This was there. Okay. Before we go into the next clip, I want to talk a little about the faith section. You can even hear, you've got that with the Hebrews 11 right there. You see from the beginning, he's introducing a very, faith, hope, and love. I really think is the message. He's also yeah, hope is going to kind of be a part of that. I do think even acknowledging death, one of the great parts of our Book of Common Prayer, I think truly one of the best written sections is actually in the funeral section. When it says a good funeral is to the very end of a funeral. It's on page, sorry, this dog is just going nuts. It's on page 507. It talks about a funeral trying to do two things. One, acknowledge the death, which I think he's trying to do in there in the beginning, that this is a mourning. This is death is in the room. Death is there. We grieve. But the second movement in any funeral has got to be toward resurrection. So I think he's trying to hold a lot of that together, and I think he's doing a pretty good Episcopalian and an AME Church job. So the next move, so we can talk about that later. The next section I want you to see is on grace, and trust me, I'm not that good of a planner. Last week, if you were with us, we talked about RFK, Robert Kennedy's impromptu speech at Martin Luther King's death, and how he went into suffering. Well, guess what the reading was this past Sunday? The cross is a way of kind of connecting with suffering. I think that's what RFK really kind of said, empathy, and empathy is how we reach one another. That was the great thing about last week. Well, this week we're talking about amazing grace, and guess what the Sunday lesson is? Grace. It's Nicodemus. We're not going to get Nicodemus, but it comes in the third chapter as Jesus. This is the image of Jesus talking to Nicodemus at night. Nicodemus talking about being born again. Nicodemus, the whole conversation is about darkness and light, about evil, and God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. It's John 3:16. That's our lesson for Sunday. So notice how I hope as you get into this theme on amazing grace, as we hear this part of the speech, that brings to life whatever you're going to hear the preacher preach this week. I'm going to take us from minute 14 to minute 21 or 15.
We do not know whether the killer of Reverend Pinckney and 8 others knew all of this history. But he surely sensed the meaning of his violent act. It was an act that drew on a long history of bombs and arson and shots fired at churches. Not random, but as a means of control, a way to terrorize and oppress. An act that he imagined would incite fear and recrimination, violence and suspicion. An act that he presumed would deepen divisions that trace back to our nation's original sin. Oh, but God works in mysterious ways. God has different ideas. He didn't know he was being used by God. Blinded by hatred, the alleged killer could not see the grace surrounding Reverend Pinckney and that Bible study group. The light of love that shone as they opened the church doors and invited a stranger to join in their prayer circle. The alleged killer could have never anticipated the way the families of the fallen would respond when they saw him in court in the midst of unspeakable grief with words of forgiveness. He couldn't imagine that. The alleged killer could not imagine how the city of Charleston, under the good and wise leadership of Mayor Riley, how the state of South Carolina, how the United States of America would respond not merely with revulsion at his evil act, but with big-hearted generosity, and more importantly, with a thoughtful introspection and self-examination that we so rarely see in public life. Blinded by hatred, he failed to comprehend what Reverend Pinckney so well understood: the power of God's grace. Yes, sir. This whole week I've been reflecting on this idea of grace. The grace of the families who lost loved ones. The grace that Reverend Pinckney would preach about in his sermons. The grace described in one of my favorite hymnals, the one we all know. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. According to the Christian tradition, grace is not earned. Grace is not merited. It's not something we deserve. Rather, grace is the free and benevolent favor of God, as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowal of blessings. Grace. As a nation, out of this terrible tragedy, God has visited grace upon us, for he has allowed us to see where we've been blind. He's given us the chance where we've been lost to find our best selves. We may not have earned it, this grace, with our rancor and complacency and short-sightedness and fear of each other. But we got it all the same. He gave it to us anyway. He's once more given us grace. But it is up to us now to make the most of it, to receive it with gratitude, and to prove ourselves worthy of this gift. For too long, we were blind to the pain that the Confederate flag stirred in too many of our citizens.
He'll continue on with the flag. We know the flag gets removed as a result of this. I want to make sure we get to the end and some other historical things on racism. So he's going to use this moment. I think back with this reading that we have here, kind of name the dark things and the light things. I think this is a theme. I mean, if you're going with grace, you're probably going to be rooted in John 3 a little, in our namesake's gospel. So I think you're working with some of that stuff, and you'll see that toward the end, that this that because of this grace we have a call to kind of act. So if you don't know, spoiler alert, he's going to end in song. You should know. This is only a few years ago. He will end singing. And I really want you to watch. This is the last few minutes I'm going to show you, and then we can open this up. The power of song in voice, in harmony, of how song, Augustine does say, he who sings prays twice. That when you're singing, you're also kind of in prayer. You'll notice kind of how God bless the former president, but he is a lawyer. He's very da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He kind of needs that at that moment in the homily as well. It's kind of, I think, in the African American tradition to really end collectively strong. So there's almost a moment, because I stand in the pulpit, that like, am I going to do this? I'm about to sing. So watch that on his face. And then it just becomes a very liberating moment and a very holy moment, I think, for the congregation gathered. And I think he knew he was going to go that route. I will say, before we begin this song, Amazing Grace, who wrote the song? Anybody know? We can maybe talk about that in the end. Let's just watch it.
In the South is progress. It must be a manual for how to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. How to break the cycle. A roadway toward a better world. He knew that the path of grace involves an open mind, but more importantly, an open heart. That's what I felt this week. An open heart. That, more than any particular policy or analysis, is what's called upon right now, I think. What a friend of mine, the writer Marilyn Robinson, calls that reservoir of goodness, beyond and of another kind, that we are able to do each other in the ordinary cause of things. That reservoir of goodness. If we can find that grace, anything is possible. If we can tap that grace, everything can change. Amazing grace. Amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I Clementa Pinckney found that grace. Cynthia Hurd found that grace. Susie Jackson found that grace. Ethel Lance found that grace. The Payne Middleton doctor found that grace. Tywanza Sanders found that grace. Daniel L. Simmons Sr. found that grace. Sharonda Coleman Singleton found that grace. Myra Thompson found that grace. through the example of their lives. They've now passed it on to us. May we find ourselves worthy of that precious and extraordinary gift as long as our lives endure. May grace now lead them home. May God continue to shed his grace on the United States of America.
I think I'll open it up right there, and anything else I've got is probably just oops. I'll get you the discussion questions in the link. So anybody know Amazing Grace? Come on, tell me now. I think I preached about this a couple weeks ago, or a couple of years ago, maybe. Y'all weren't listening. Oh, nope, that's not it. Sorry, that's a link to Oakland Cemetery.
Oakland is great too, though.
It's a great cemetery. I was sending that to the cemetery people earlier. Let's see if here you go. Laurel's here. Uh-oh. Yeah, thoughts of so Amazing Grace was written by John Newton. If you look at it in your prayer book, John Newton was the priest, one of the big priests in the abolition movement. John Newton is the one that really shaped William Wilberforce, who abolished slavery in England. So it has its, I mean, so you think about just that hymnody and the power of that hymnody, and in this context of a very racially motivated crime, there's another layer, like Nicodemus, there's another layer in all that. So any questions or thoughts about what struck you about the speech? What did it teach you about grace? Why was it considered one of the major speeches? What does it call you to do? I've been talking a lot.
Well, I can say that I grew up in the African American church. So what I saw in this service is I'm accustomed to, and in a lot of our services, I grew up in the Baptist church. We had what we would call devotional services. And there were services that were usually prior to the worship service. And during that time, a lot of times the Amazing Grace was sung during the devotional service. And it was always followed by a prayer from the deacon or whomever. And it didn't have to be, usually the deacon or whomever was the leader. But the prayer that usually followed, it always followed, complemented the song. And the prayer was always about forgiveness. It was always, people would always, a lot of times people have their own personal stories, and they would use their personal stories, and it was always attached to the fact that because of grace, we're here, and because of grace, we will keep moving on. It was always, I grew up in a church where suffering was always talked about, because, basically it was always at some point, there was some type of suffering that was going on. Someone was suffering for some reason. And the church, people were always vocal about it. I think it was a way for them to, for us, not them, for me, for us to express and release the tensions from the week. And so this is typical for a service. This is typical for a funeral. And I think it's just the life that we live as African Americans. So it's just common.
Thank you. To hold that to hold the words of grace in the context of suffering, and also on that weekly basis, suffering and rejoicing. I mean, to see grace
Right.
in the whole kind of
And knowing that there's going to be a better day. So, you always know that, okay, we're going through this, but this won't be always, and God will protect us and give us, a grace, and I know I was taught as a child about grace and to understand that, you can't earn it. It's nothing you can do. It was the
unmerited.
gift of God. And
He was
so
quoting the catechism right there, wasn't he?
Right. We didn't call it that with Sunday school, whatever they used to call it. But I'm just saying. So, and then you saw your ancestors. I would see my mom, I would see my grandmom, not my great mom, but my great aunts. And those are discussions at the tables, and it was normal discussions, but I come rooted from a very strong Christian background. And so, I heard that quite often.
Thank you. Yeah, he said in that last section of that speech, on the have an open mind and an open heart. Pay attention on Sunday, guys. We're Nicodemus. It's
okay.
Nicodemus there.
Okay.
So he's all in that. Somebody else want to jump in this. So any other thoughts from folks? Don't make me talk the whole time.
Well, I think at the end, he challenged all of us to live into what he had talked about those people had lived into. He talked a lot about the person who committed the crime, being blind. And these people were full of grace and love. And then he challenged us to be like them,
Thank you. Yeah.
I during that time, I know I would listen to commentaries about people really didn't understand how the family members could tell him that they forgave him. A lot of people really just didn't understand that, and I don't even know if I could do that. I would be able to do that if my husband had been killed. I don't know who the actual people who were saying that, but that takes a strong conviction. But those people, right, were in Bible study. So I think that they understood that and they came out with a statement. And I believe they were sincere with that. But also that helps give you peace also, when you feel like tragedy happens, you have to find a way to cope. Yeah. And so that's grace too, And
in our world, I mean, it almost read like I remember that week, in 2015, and seeing the trials. And I think that was one of the reasons, back to Philip's kind of question, I'm going to get that link, Philip, put it in here before we leave tonight, was one of the reasons I think Obama took this text and maybe, if he had thrown some stuff out there, he made a major re-edit before he was going down there to speak, in the sense of, I think he was moved by the testimony. Literally, it was a court testimony. The people coming forward and saying, "Hey, family members, you're forgiven."
right.
That's one way. It's one way love. Doesn't mean I'm not pissed. Doesn't mean I'm
Right.
probably going to have bad thoughts. But this grace thing is really rooted in the cross, and it's rooted in forgiveness. And like it or leave it, this is who we are. And and Cheryl, I think to your point, is we become a increasingly less religious society, that will be a very foreign message to a lot of people. It was interesting to see that week, because this is really the central message of our faith, and so they've definitely bore that out. Any others?
I thought it was, this is Mary Bird.
Hey, Mary
I
Bird.
thought it was fabulous. I love that he named the people multiple times. He made it very, very personal for that congregation. He acted as though he had been a trained preacher. I mean, I always like to listen to him speak. That's just one of my things. I like to listen to Obama's speeches. He's so articulate and emotional. I get chills every time I listen to this speech. And when I think about what happened after that and how almost prophetic some of his images were, it's really interesting to me because he was a president, and I don't know, we have elected officials that not so many of them could have done what he did that day.
No, yeah, thank you for that. I think you recognize I mean, I think there's something, yeah, we talk about I could talk about a zillion things on that. I think you're right. He's young. He's very articulate. He knows kind of what his charismas are. I think he's pretty political to be elected president that young. You're aware of moments where you maybe need to step in, right? I just call that awareness, a fruit of the spirit, maybe. And so I think he knows he needs to be there. First African American, somebody that I also think you recognize the town of Charleston, no matter what side of the aisle you were on politically, was very wounded by it. I mean, this is a senator. This is the pastor of one of your mother churches. I think the whole city was shaken. So I think you recognize the moment of, and as he said in the end, the unitedness. I've got to have a message, very spiritual message, but also kind of emphasize the unitedness of that. So yeah, Mary Bird, I agree. Thank you.
And on such a big day when he had learned the other news first,
Yeah.
it's amazing that he got it together to do both.
Yeah, and how much? Yeah, was that a surprise? Did he know that this morning? Something he'd been kind of politically fighting for, and then again, I think the theme of, he did talk about that, of that very opening part of death. All we should want in our eulogies to be what? Good people. Well, that was what Ash Wednesday begins the season of Lent, reminding you. You think about this, and maybe hey, this big piece of legislation I work for. I'm not saying there's nothing, anything, but it's politics. It's politics. But in the end, we all are dead, and that was a very important piece of legislation. I don't want to negate that, but we get caught up in our life, and we forget that life is a gift. I think he gets centered on that night. And I think that's those people were around, those kids. I think he was also impacted by the children too. There were a couple of other clips later in there you could see him seeing that. I think that just does a number on you. Well. Any last thoughts? Philip, you got a hand raised. I don't often see those, but just jump on in.
Yeah. And by the way, that article, yeah, if you have the link, you can send it. But I'd really just, I can look it up myself.
I put it in the
I
chat.
appreciate it.
Y'all see it in the chat?
Oh, it is.
It's in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see. I didn't look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay. I'll get it.
It's in that. That's a good one. I think it does talk about, and I think Meacham quotes that one in the podcast about how he took his old yellow tablets like whenever he saw the President Obama with his yellow legal pad, it was a.
But I raised my hand because of kind of going back to what Cheryl was talking about, or kind of, she kind of, I don't know, she's kind of teased it out of me. I feel like I kind of got a connection with the song "Amazing Grace" because I don't.
Oh, you're breaking up, Philip.
I've been with this. It's actually a little stuttering. Never had spiritual gifts. And Miss Cheryl said that she couldn't forgive somebody, but You know, I think I was in one of those situations where I didn't think I could forgive somebody, but I was given that amazing grace.
Yeah.
And I can't, and I wish I could say that it came from me, but I don't feel like that it was generated from me. I think, oh, I don't know. I want to talk about it. I just want to give people hope that could come, or that can be expressed, and somebody can feel that. If you don't understand somebody, maybe they got that, or I don't know. It's something I can witness about. So it changed the way I thought about that song.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a powerful passage. I want your homework tonight or this week is to really read the entirety of John chapter 3 before Sunday. When you want to talk about, you know, that one-way love that Jesus is trying to talk to Nicodemus about, that hardness of that. And you see Nicodemus again at the cross. So remember that. He makes another appearance. I actually think he makes two more appearances, but the most profound one is at the end, at the cross. He comes to Jesus at night, and the wind blows where it will. The wind blows where it will. It's not something, grace isn't something we can, it takes God to help us to do that. And I think that was a part of the sermon tonight, and that's a part of, that's hopefully a part of the sermon on Sunday, whoever's preaching. It better not be me. I don't think it is. But it's good to be with you all tonight. It's 8:31. I'll be back here same time, same place next week. And I think it's Barbara Jordan next week, or it could be Ronald Reagan. It's one of the two. I'll know by next week too. So yeah, when these speakers line up with the gospel passages, and I don't even know what's next week, you know that was a Holy Spirit moment. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.